Hello and welcome to the Kyjabo channel, and today we're going to be doing something I think is pretty ambitious. So I've decided to create a list of the 100 most watched movies of all time, ranked from worst to best. Now you may be wondering how this information is going to be acquired, because if we use highest grossing films, it's just going to be all recent stuff due to high inflation levels. So what I've attempted to do is use a credible source in Filmsite, and I'm going to sort of merge these three lists together to make what I feel to be an accurate yet still entertaining compilation of analyses on each and every one of the most watched movies of all time. I'm going to go into a little more detail for certain films that I have more to say on, and less on those that aren't as interesting, obviously. If you want a deeper analysis on how I picked what movies to look at, I'll include it all in the description, but I'm sure you've already seen how long this video is, so I'd quite like to just get into it. And we'll be starting off, of course, with the worst movie of the top 100 most watched movies of all time. Oh, baby. It's, Transformers: Age of Extinction. In fact, Dark of the Moon and Revenge of the Fallen are being put here too. I mean, do I even really need to justify this decision? I don't think there's a single person who even bothers to attempt to defend these films. Michael Bay is notoriously one of the biggest hacks in the directing industry, and he's never made anything good. Ever. I'm not even saying Transformers 2 and 3 are better than Age of Extinction, but at least they have the excuse of being written in or just out of the writer's strike, whereas 4 is simply unforgivable. There is no excuse for these films' qualities. Absolutely nothing happens in any of them, but the combined runtime of the three is like 8 hours long. You'd probably have more fun spending 8 hours at an office 9 to 5 than binging these three movies. Bay shoots every scene the same way, so you know exactly what you're getting into after 30 fucking seconds. I didn't even have the F word on the script, but I just said it because of how angry this film gets me. I'm trying not to swear this video. There's absolutely nothing interesting about how these films are directed, or written, or shot, or written, or shot, or directed. They look horrific and ugly, and only idiots enjoy these films, and I'm incredibly opposed to judging someone based on the movies they watch, but if you enjoy these movies, don't even talk to me. Unsubscribe from the... Honestly, just kill yourself. Bay's lack of integrity is offensively clear in every one of these films. He's a weird pervert who devotes like 10 minutes of Transformers 4 to explaining why a character isn't committing statutory...
She's a 17-year-old girl, so we can work this two ways. One, I punch you right in the mouth and you call the police on me.
Dad.
Or two, I just call the cops on you because this is illegal. She's a minor.
We're protected by the Romeo and Juliet laws.
We dated for a little while. I was a sophomore and he was a senior. It's fine.
No, it's not fine.
We've got a pre-existing juvenile foundational relationship. Statute 270.
This 3-hour movie somehow reaches a screeching halt, despite it already being excruciatingly slow in terms of speed, to explain why it's okay that a 21-year-old is with a 17-year-old. You'll have to pardon me for not knowing these characters' names, I just can't be bothered. But why didn't you just make the 17-year-old like 20 years old, saving all of our precious times? Why is it so important to you that this grossly sexualized character is 17 years old, you perverted tosser? Obviously, you get your fair share of racism, and all the Asians know Kung Fu because of course they do. Look, I really don't want to keep talking about these films. They're not only some of the worst movies on this list, but some of the worst movies of all time. So much so that I would even hesitate to call them movies. They're just products that no one asked for, so that billions of dollars could be made through merchandising and foreign movie markets. The toys these movies are based on qualify more as movies than these worthless pieces of trash. Everything that could possibly be bad in the movie, this film flourishes in. I wouldn't even be surprised if it came out that these movies were the result of some weird challenge to make the worst film possible and destroy a previously beloved franchise. Transformers are so uncool, they're so lame now, and you have these films to blame for it. To be honest, I'm pretty irate that they've earned as much money at the box office as they have. And the only silver lining is that Transformers 5 isn't on this list, so I didn't need to watch it for the sake of this video, because I actually might not have made it if I had to. From one franchise to another, for 97 I've gone for Star Wars Attack of the Clones, which I believe to be the worst Star Wars movie, mainly due to it being the one where the least happens. These prequels are cursed with horribly phony and plastic looking scenery, from the foliage to the backgrounds to even the characters. Seriously, why do they look like that? How did Yoda look so much better in the movies that were made decades earlier? If it ain't broke, don't fix it, yo. Just use a puppet like you're supposed to, you idiots. I mean, just viewing the background footage on screen right now will remind you why these movies are so hated, and why George Lucas is such a contentious character. The romance is some of the worst that audiences have ever seen. The writing in general is pretty abysmal. We're just sort of told that we need to like these characters, like Anakin and Obi-Wan, but we're not actually given any reason to enjoy their presence. If anything, we're given the opposite impression. I hate all of these characters. I could go on, but I think I'll just let the team explain some of this movie's most glaring issues.
Every single frame, every single shot in the movie has a digital effect.
Pretty much every set has blue screen, even if it's just out a window or something.
It's everywhere. I think I've been on one set where there hasn't been any blue screen.
The guy who's creating that character will create their responses off how you respond to their responses that aren't there. It's a nightmare.
The original franchise, which we will get to later, worked so well because despite the intergalactic scale of these wars and the mystery of the Jedi and the Force, it all fundamentally feels so human and so down to earth, almost somber in its presentation, stoic and calm where it needed to be, but tense and aggressive where it needed to be as well. All of this humanity is completely sucked out of these prequels, and in an attempt to make something as epic as possible, they make something that's poorly acted, ugly, an utter snooze fest that exposes how dumb and unserious this story about space wizards actually is. A silliness that isn't even considered in the originals due to just how pleasant and hearty they were. It's for these exact reasons that my number 96 spot is going to The Phantom Menace, which I only consider to be a little better because more things happen. There's actually an interesting storyline, especially initially because what we'd seen before was episode 6, and that was fantastic. Fair enough, this momentum isn't carried on for very long at all in the film, but it's more than the negative momentum coming into the second film. Much like the previous 5 entries, there's going to be a running theme with the next couple picks, so let's quickly go over The Lion King remake, Beauty and the Beast remake, Aladdin remake, and Jungle Book remake. Now, I do want to specify that I don't hate the Jungle Book one as much as I do the other 3, hence the order, but almost purely due to my utter hatred for the concept of these remakes, I'm putting them all here. Now, you may have noticed that every movie so far has either been a part of a franchise or an overarching business decision, because these remakes aren't exactly a franchise, but it's the reason I'm always wary when there's a new entry in a long and beloved franchise. The issue is when a movie isn't a brand new idea, the probability of ulterior and corrupt business motives becomes higher, and increases exponentially the more beloved said initial idea is. So for Transformers and the Star Wars prequels, for example, you can tell there was no passion, no heart, no one wanted to make those movies, and a similar idea applies to these remakes. Perhaps to an even stronger extent. These are so genuinely offensive on so many levels, but we'll begin with how unnecessary they are. The originals for each of these films were all animated in a truly timeless 2D style, a clearly intentional decision to keep them held up for as long as possible. These remakes, however, have already begun to age mere months after their release. Like, what's going on here? What is this? There is absolutely no emotion in these CGI shams because there's some weird obsession with making them look as realistic as possible. The Beast just looks awful. Everything in Aladdin especially looks terrible. Jesus Christ, Aladdin might be one of the most ugliest movies from the 2010s. Every single song is completely thrashed. Will Smith can't sing, so they just drench his voice in auto-tune.
Prince Ali, my ears, he, Ali Ababa.
The goodness of this film has been beaten and stabbed and killed in the ground, with no understanding of what made the originals so great. All 4 of these movies have one thing in common, and that's that every scene, every set piece, every idea, every line, every mere blink is just a far worse version of the original. And whilst I might have placed them above the previous 2 franchises, there is no doubt that I am never angrier when discussing film, an art form that I love so much, than when I'm talking or thinking about these sham Disney remakes, especially as someone who has such a soft spot for the originals. And for that reason, we're gonna have to move on before I break something. Alright, 91 is the Twilight Saga Breaking Dawn Part 2, which once again is based upon a pre-existing idea, or more specifically, a sequel to a pre-existing idea. Look, I'm sorry, but I didn't watch part 1. I've got things to do, man. So I've just watched part 2, which I guess made more money for some reason. This is easily some of the worst romance that's ever been written for characters who are supposedly meant to be smitten with each other. There's a horrendous lack of charisma from the cast, and the source material is also pretty trashy. What you see is what you get with Twilight, and unfortunately all I see is a mindless motion of moving pictures for lil babies and tweens. There was a weird amount of action that I wasn't expecting, but it's not done well at all. The whole thing is pretty amateur, and these are supposed to be serious and scary faces, I guess, but they just look really weird and dumb. It turns into, like, the X-Men at some point. These aren't vampires, they can control, like, sand and wind and water. They're all avatars now, I guess. The second act is just really, really boring, with nothing to even ironically laugh at. Then as the movie climaxes, there's a massive snowy set piece with one of the worst, most confusing endings I've seen in a while. It tries so hard to be epic. Everyone's just like karate chopping each other's heads off. There's like wolves being summoned and they're crying and screeching. Some bloke punches the floor and destroys everything. All the faces are really weird and ugly. Something's really building up here, like my goodness. It's getting kind of tense, but then it's all a dream and some Brazilian guy enters the scene out of nowhere to convince the villain that everything's chill and the movie ends. What?! So apparently book fans were annoyed at this final battle scene too. When the book came out, the ending was widely regarded to be weak since they build up to this war the whole book and then just end up talking it out in like 20 minutes. The movie tries to rectify this by giving the action that fans had really been yearning for, but because it was unwilling to commit to anything, but the blissy happy ending of the book, it just ended up peeving them off too. Now at 90 we have Venom. Knock knock, let the devil in, malevolent medicine. This genuinely might be the worst script so far, like even worse than Twilight. Venom is supposed to be... Sorry, my bad. Venom is supposed to be a villain, right? But I guess Sony just decided to make him a superhero now. So Venom is just a superhero now, which is nowhere near as fun and far more generic and boring. Tom Hardy just sort of breaks into this place and becomes Venom, but there's no locks on any of the doors. Or security cameras, I guess, so that's a little odd for a highly guarded biochemical facility. Just a sloppy, bad, embarrassing mess that never should have been released. 89 is not only our first animated feature, but also the first Illumination movie on this list, and unfortunately, there's going to be a whole lot more of these. For now, however, for whatever reason, The Secret Life of Pets has made enough money and garnered enough attention to scam itself onto this list. On most days, I would usually give this a 4 or 5 out of 10, because Illumination has mastered factory-produced movies that never progress past bang average at best, and bottom-of-the-barrel stink at worst. But for whatever reason, this is the movie I loathed rewatching for the sake of this video more so than any other on this list, even the ones below it. I honestly couldn't tell you why. I don't have as much hatred in my heart for Illumination as I do the Disney remakes because they're not trying to change or quote-unquote improve anything from a previously perfect product. But as a standalone thing, Illumination's films are so much worse. I just realized I haven't even said anything about this movie. Look, to be completely honest, I can't be bothered. Just watch the trailer and you've basically seen the movie. It's just Toy Story plus cute cat video minus everything that's good about those two things. 86, Suicide Squad, so I guess we're some kind of Suicide Squad. Yeah, baby, I'm Will Smith. There are scenes in this movie that are so dark that it's actually nearly impossible to see what's going on, even in the daytime scenes. Jared Leto is notoriously awful and embarrassing, but was still somehow the most entertaining part of the film, and I wish he was in it more, because there would have been something to cringe at rather than gawk at for how boring it's being. I don't like Will Smith at all. I've always hated him ever since he slapped Kevin James in that one movie.
Get out.
Oh my god, it was being foreshadowed this whole time. Anyway, let's have a look at some great acting, writing, and lighting, and editing from the brilliant movie Suicide Squad.
What do we have here?
What are you gonna do? You gonna kill me, Mr. J?
What? Oh, I'm not gonna kill you. I'm just gonna hurt you. Really, really.
Okay, it's Captain Marvel, baby. In fact, weirdly enough, the next 3 entries are all going to be Marvel's debut on this list. It's just a shame that they happen to be some of their weakest projects. This is probably Marvel's lamest movie, starring one of their lamest characters, acted by an actress who's actually rather competent, but in this movie just comes across as lame. Probably due to the script and direction. It's always a horrific sign when the main character is the worst part of your movie. Everything is way too predictable. Nick Fury's eye scar backstory is also really lame and annoying. Like, they make it seem so cool in Winter Soldier.
You need to keep both eyes open.
But then it's revealed that a little kiddie just scratched his face a little bit. Whose idea was this? You've got to give it to Marvel though. They took the initiative and broke the glass ceiling, displaying to everybody that women can be just as boring as men. Sam Jackson was probably the best part of the film because he can actually act and is clearly used to playing his character by this point. And the makeup used to make him look young is actually really impressive and convincing, but that doesn't make me like the movie anymore. It's still really boring. Avengers Age of Ultron this high on the list might come as a little bit of a shock to you guys, but at the very least we can all agree that it's the weakest of the Avengers movies. I don't think anyone actually remembers anything about this film, so I'm shocked it actually made it onto the top 100. But like much of the movies at this point on the list, it's just bloody boring. It's better than Captain Marvel because the script allowed for some okay moments between the characters who display a decent amount of chemistry, particularly in the fairly well choreographed yet still very mindless action scenes, and also Hawkeye does shine a little bit. Whilst that may sound like a somewhat extensive list of positives, that only describes about 10% of the film. The other 90% is just Marvel at their worst, playing it so painstakingly safe and uninterestingly. Now on to Spider-Man 3, the least enjoyable Spider-Man film by far. So in terms of positives, I think it's so easy to see what Sam Raimi genuinely wanted to include, and what he really didn't care for. Raimi clearly wanted to make a story about Sandman, and so the majority of choices and moments regarding his character aren't too bad, but I wouldn't quite call them good either. Raimi absolutely and blatantly wanted nothing less than to include Venom as well as Gwen Stacy, and whatever other weird things happen in this film. Because of this, the first act is a total mess trying to establish a movie that has far too much ambition and way too many things going on, yet still manages to stay the high point of the film. There are good ideas sprinkled here and there, for action particularly. I quite enjoy the idea of a fight focusing on keeping hold of this ring, for example, but there wasn't enough budget nor was there enough progression in CGI at the time to make these ideas work. Unfortunately, there's just too much here to forgive, and it results in a soggy and unorganized mess of a film where nothing really works. The characters are all so unlikable, especially Mary Jane, who is somehow even worse than she was in the previous films, and they destroy Peter's character as well. He goes from lovable and charming in his corniness to an annoying moron who I want to die. 84 is the newest Doctor Strange film, and this video is long enough already. There's 20 minutes of footage of me destroying this film already, so go watch my review if you care at all. 83 is Wonder Woman, and 82 is Far From Home, because these movies have very similar issues, I feel. I'm just so sick of these safe snooze fests. These two films are pretty much as disposable as you can get. The music is fine, the effects are fine, but nothing ever really catches my eye. The cinematography in these films are always as bland as a bollock, and in Far From Home especially, there are no interesting shots at all, despite the potential and scenery. You could honestly cut and paste this paragraph and apply it to like 90% of superhero films. 81 is Alice in Wonderland. It's weird that this movie's theme is all about Alice making her own choices, but the plot is about Alice doing exactly what the prophecy predetermined she would do. I've never understood how one of the most colourful and trippy stories ever made could be turned into this grey and messy world. I just remember Alice in Wonderland 2010 being sapped of life with none of the fun and interesting elements of the Book and Disney film. The scene where Johnny Depp's character just starts dancing near the end of the movie is one of my least favourite memories being in a cinema. I think this is an absolute disgrace to the source material, which I have a fond nostalgia for, and I've lost all hope in Tim Burton. 80 is a Chinese one called The Battle at Lake Changjin, which was a huge deal in 2021, albeit in China. You've probably not heard of this before, nor did I, to be honest, until this far into the video. So I won't go on for too long, but I gave it a watch and it's all pretty propagandistic. The action scenes weren't actually too bad, but some may read it as a dreadful misreading of the Korean War. So this film had a huge budget and attempts to recount the war in an entertaining way, but also one that displays the Chinese army as victors, when in reality there weren't really any winners in this battle. It was pretty horrendous for everyone. The US are villainous to an unrealistic extent. Look, I don't want to get too political or whatever, and the film does get a lot of the history correct, of course. History aside, though, there really isn't anything to write home about. The writing is poor and the music is boring, so on and so forth. Moving on. Shrek the Third swoops in for 79th on this list, which was so shocking because I hate this film so much. And it's sort of occurring to me that the majority of this list is really, really bad, so that's a real shame. Anyway, once again, I've made a whole video talking about Shrek, so I won't dwell on it too much. The soundtrack was good, but it was used horribly here. The best thing about The Passion of the Christ was the South Park episode that they made about it. 77 is Ice Age Continental Drift. Ugh. Blue Sky really had something when they entered the scene with the original Ice Age, which I have very fond memories of. It's not a masterpiece by any means, but Ice Age is an actually well thought out and passionate, feel-good movie. As far as animated family films go, Ice Age is pretty top tier. Blue Sky really milked this series' titties to the most bone-dry place you could ever take it. Once again, just watch the trailer for this one and you'll be good. There's an abysmal romance subplot between Diego and some woman with zero chemistry. It's the most unconvincing relationship you could ever write. The animation was good but not great, and Scrat was funny, but it's nothing we haven't already seen before in this exact series. In terms of characters, they took the quantity over quality approach, and all of the pre-existing characters failed to develop at all. I also completely forgot about the B-plot with Manny's daughter, I guess, so I'll tack this on at the end to say that I hate it. It sucks. Go away, Ice Age. It's time for a bit of a throwback, baby, because we're back to Transformers! Oh yeah, you know how much I love... whatever, man. It's the original this time. Don't get it twisted, though. I still hate this movie. It's just not quite as offensive as its sequels. Just a super underwhelming summer blockbuster. Still Michael Bay, just being Michael Bay. Talking about it now, I can't believe how the sequels are so much worse, considering how much this one pongs. I have absolutely nothing positive to say about this series. Once again, I'm gonna put Star Wars right after Transformers because 75 is Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. I have all the same complaints I made about the earlier movies at the start of this video, but I placed this film higher up purely because things actually happen. That is all. Next off we have Minions, and Minions Rise of Gru, and Despicable Me 3, which is honestly just another case of the Blue Sky effect. And whilst I don't hate these movies as much as Ice Age 4 in terms of quality, I hate them far more in terms of the principles of art and movie making. I hate how inescapable the Minions are. I hate how unoriginal and cliché Gru has become as a character after being genuinely likable in the first movie. I hate how it seems as though the soul of the animated movie industry has been ripped out and beaten to death by this hack of a company. I hate how cheap the animation looks. I hate how this far into the list, we still haven't come across a movie that I like or even don't mind. So 71 and 70 are Finding Dory and Toy Story 4, which are both some of the most insanely useless and unnecessary sequels that have ever been created. These are movies that nobody asked for, but they made anyway for merchandising, nostalgia baiting, and of course because they knew how well they'd perform. The only reason these aren't lower on the list is because Pixar always goes ham with the animation. These look great, I'll give it to them, but that doesn't make the movies any less pointless. They don't do anything wrong necessarily, but they don't do anything memorable either. If you're a parent who wants an hour of sleep, just slap these movies on and hypnotize your child with some mindless, colourful media so you can relax. That's all these movies are good for. If you want further elaboration, I have a whole video on Pixar and its proclivity for these sequels. So 69 is Deadpool 2. This movie is, in some ways, an improvement from its predecessor, mainly in terms of shot composition, because I was certainly impressed with a lot more of the interesting presentation here. Like, it's easily the most well-shot live-action film so far on the list, probably due to it having a director different from the first. Unfortunately, it's worse in every other way. I just, unfortunately, don't find Deadpool as irreverent and groundbreaking as many others do, both the character and the franchise. I actually find this MC intensely irritating and not very funny at all. The writing gives me a bit of a Family Guy vibe, which obviously is a very bad vibe to have. The CGI is weirdly terrible in regards to characters like Colossus. I think this one might just come down to personal distaste. It just really irks me how clever this film thinks it is, almost taunting you with its stupid, smug tone, whilst maintaining a realistically safe and predictable story, much like every other superhero movie that it claims to be ridiculing. But it goes without saying I don't find it anywhere near as offensive as many of the others on this list. I'm probably the least angry at this one so far. Iron Man takes 68. Yeah, I really don't like this film. It has a horrible twist ending, the child acting was awful, and it suffers from everything Marvel movies always tend to suffer from. Once again, I have a whole video dedicated to these films. 67 and 66 are going to be the first two Hunger Games films. These are pretty identical in terms of quality. They've got mediocre written all over them. They don't do anything that I consider to be above average. I think Jennifer Lawrence is actually pretty brilliant, but just not in these movies for whatever reason. There are some really cheesy and melodramatic moments that are supposed to be serious, but just end up being unintentionally humorous. Catching Fire is pretty much an exact redo of the first one, but it is helped slightly by the lack of as many annoying characters. I know that I'm not the target audience for these films. They know exactly what they are, and they've curated this franchise to appeal to exactly what its fans require in the media they consume. Whatever, it has its hardcore fan base. I can't get mad at this at all. It's just not my thing, really. I think it's really, really dumb. Bohemian Rhapsody is our first, and I believe only biopic on this list. And yeah, it's pretty bad. Right off the bat, I think Rami Malek did a phenomenal job playing Freddie Mercury. This is the most impressive acting performance so far on the list. Every other aspect is bad, unfortunately. This isn't shot horribly, but it's absolutely ruined by the editing, which is some of the worst I've ever seen in big budget Hollywood. There's a cut every 2 seconds. I feel like I'm watching a British YouTube vlogger from like 2014. This film was somehow nominated for Best Editing of the Year, which is ridiculous. I mean, it probably had the most editing, but that does not equate to the best in the slightest. What's worse is that it actually ended up winning Best Ending, despite how notoriously horrendous the ending actually was. I would go as far as to say that this film is straight up disrespectful to the story and origins of such legendary pieces of music. If it wasn't for Rami Malek and the music of Queen, this probably would have been somewhere around 90 on the list. Much like Captain Marvel, Black Panther is brave enough to break the mold, proving that black people can also be boring. You're probably sick of me saying this, but it's just painfully average and boring. This one somehow became a weird figurehead that was placed at the forefront of adult political commentary, when in reality it's a dumb superhero movie for babies. The film takes place in such beautiful scenery, but they never actually do anything with the environment that they're given. It all just looks so fake and artificial. At this point, it shouldn't come as a surprise that this is not my type of movie, and you won't enjoy it unless you're obsessed with Marvel. Yeah, that's right. I'm sure this might have given you a bit of whiplash to a certain degree, but I would rather watch Despicable Me 2 over Black Panther. I mean, it just goes to show that we're still at such a disappointing level of quality despite being almost halfway through this list. I mean, it might just be down to nostalgia perhaps. My generation sort of grew up with this franchise, so I remember adoring it when I was a stupid child, and upon rewatching it for this video, I caught myself smiling like some silly Burke just out of nostalgia. Now don't worry, that's not why it's here, because when I look at it objectively, it's just like every other factory-produced bottom-of-the-barrel, offensive, terrible, no-integrity Illumination films that I hate so much. It's just that this one isn't quite as low on the said barrel as something like Minions or Secret Life of Pets is. Aquaman is undoubtedly one of the worst movies on this list when looked at objectively, but I simply can't bring myself to hate it because of just how dumb and fun a lot of it is. Say what you want about this film, but it's pretty graciously entertaining and ironically enjoyable. I will say though, there's this Pitbull song called Ocean to Ocean, which, and I'm not exaggerating here, might be the worst song I've ever heard in my entire life. I'll play a snippet, but not too long because of copyright.
From ocean to ocean, sea to sea, I'm something that you gotta see.
It's so ridiculously terrible that I can't help but laugh at just how tonally deaf the film is. Despite how cool and serious the scenes and soundtrack take themselves, the worst and least entertaining part is probably the forced romance subplot that just kind of pretends like there's chemistry between the two leads. That part was just bad and boring, but the rest is pretty epic and funny and epic. This film is really epic. It's Aquaman, man. What you see is what you get, baby. It's probably the best DC film in this recent universe timeline thing centered around a singular character. Just to make it absolutely clear though, this is not a good movie unless you view it ironically, which is why it's 62 on this list. The next two entries are ones from the Jumanji franchise. It's Chris Rock and The Rock and Jack Black in it. Probably the most boring movies on this list. Something like Transformers is enraging and annoying, but these movies don't quite reach that level of terror. They're just boring. Which almost makes them worse in a way, if you know what I mean. I actually have pretty much identical things to say about Spectre, which I'll put at 59, and also No Time to Die, which I'll put at 58. I don't know how Hollywood made James Bond versus the Illuminati boring, but they did, and I really don't want to dwell on it, so we're moving on. Star Wars makes yet another return at 57, but this time it's the latest entry, Episode 9, Rise of Skywalker, which is the weakest Star Wars film excluding the prequels. The entire experience feels pretty stale and creatively bankrupt, with bland action set pieces and actually really hacky writing. Everything feels way too familiar and uninteresting. The only shocking parts were only shocking because they were stupid. It's such an insulting and unsatisfying conclusion that didn't need to be made at all. The only reason it isn't lower on the list is because I'm partially blinded by my love for Star Wars. I remember there was such an insane level of hype amongst my generation when Batman vs Superman was originally released. I must have been in primary school at the time, or at least early secondary, but I'll never forget just how much people were talking about this, because when it was released, even us idiot children sort of lost interest immediately. The hype just rapidly fizzled away over how lackluster the final product was. Yeah, this film is a disaster. Terribly acted, terribly directed, terribly written, and terribly pretentious. It's way too long, pretty boring, it's only here because it has its highlights. The action is actually pretty stellar. The courthouse scene is amazing, I'm just gonna say that. The Batman warehouse scene is also incredible, and the titular fight has its moments too, aided by a brilliant soundtrack. Fast and Furious 7 is infamous for that one scene with that one song that goes, "Oh!" But they actually think that that scene is really cheesy and does not work emotionally for me at all. If you enjoyed the other movies, you'll enjoy this one. Fast and Furious is the most open book in the movie industry. What you see is truly exactly what you get, and that's not something I care for, unfortunately. Hi Mum is another Chinese one that's only here because 100 movies is a more clickable title than 99. I have nothing to say about this one. It's such a nothing movie. Go away. Mission Impossible Fallout is yet another rather boring and formulated entry, albeit helped by a myriad of really well put together and impressive action scenes and set pieces. Really great choreography and effects and ideas, but totally not worth suffering through the rest of the movie for, with all its failed attempts at emotion and plot conveniences and cliches. I do think it marks somewhat of a turning point in this list though, insofar as every movie that came before this is intolerable at best, and every movie after this will be tolerable at worst. To mark the beginning of these tolerable movies, we have the third Ice Age movie, the dinosaur one. It looks pretty and it's something new that we haven't seen before in the series, so there are certain aspects that you don't know the future of exactly. The new characters here are actually pretty fun, and they do a fair bit with the environment and its characters and prehistoric theming or whatever. Unfortunately, the pre-established characters are trite and uninteresting, completely cursed with the normalities of every badly written, factory-produced animated family feature. It's better than the fourth one, but that truly isn't saying much. 51 is Frozen 2, which is certainly a movie that exists. It looks great and the music works very well, but it's fundamentally a forced sequel with a bad story and a catchy motive. I would admit that probably the only reason it isn't lower is because there's a Weezer song, and a good one as well. I think I just like Weezer a bit too much. Next comes Iron Man, the first and most boring Marvel film of all. Just watch my superhero video, I seriously can't be bothered, it's fine, moving on. Now we're finally at the midpoint of this list, and what a journey it's been so far. I'm slowly regretting making this video, but I've devoted far too much time to watching these movies critically and writing the script to stop now. But that aside, number 49 is The Incredibles 2, which once again I talk about in a previous video of mine. But I'll go over it really quickly. The film looks brilliant, the music is great, and some of the later fight scenes were interesting, but it ultimately never escapes the realm of nostalgia cash grab. It's blatant that the bare minimum amount of effort was put into this movie, and it's very obvious that no one actually cared or had any passion for the project. To me, it's just so clear that the only reason this is set on the same day as the events of the previous film is because the team was too lazy to come up with new character designs or conceptualize how these characters and settings might have changed in a 70s or 80s environment. And also because they wanted Jack to stay as a baby because it's funny and cute, haha lol. Look, I know this is going to be a very controversial one, but Avengers Endgame is 48th on this list, I don't care. Yeah, the third act is kinda cool. There are really epic moments and some well thought out ideas, but it's so needlessly long and so stupidly boring at points. I don't care that the intentions are to be slow and tense and establish a depressing and somber tone at the beginning. You can do those things while still being entertaining, which I feel as though Marvel kind of forgets they can do. Captain Marvel is really stupid. Thor is really stupid. The Hulk is so dumb now. He went from a threatening and interesting Jekyll and Hyde type of character to a big green Mark Ruffalo. Nothing makes any sense whatsoever. Tony Stark doesn't seem to be trying very hard when he makes the time machine, and his daughter is just a very bad actress. Cap somehow appearing in the same scene aged and older after just being transported completely contradicts the rules of time travel set by this exact film. Nebula is one of the stupidest characters I think I've ever seen, and her stupidity is so outrageous that it single-handedly wrecks much of the film's tension. Like, she falls over at one point because there's another her in the timeline she's in, but there is absolutely nothing stopping her from just pressing the button on her suit and going back. But she doesn't! Speaking of which, why wouldn't she tell the Avengers that Thanos and herself were in the timeline before they were transported, rather than the second after they travelled? The past version of her summons Thanos and his ship by just sticking her fingers in the time machine. So could current her not have just done that but with the Infinity Stones, thus negating the events of this entire movie? But I still didn't mind this film. I'm only being negative in an attempt to justify its somewhat lower position on this list, but it is 48, so let's not get it twisted. It's not bad at all, just also not good. It's saved by the third act sheer action, which very almost becomes far too much, but never quite crosses the line into unbearable and mind-numbing. I think people are slightly blinded by the insane build-up and emotion of the film and the death and so on and so forth, but when you look at it objectively, yeah, it's fine. Deadpool is also pretty fine. It was such a breath of fresh air when it originally aired. It's very much a refreshing change of pace from the average Marvel movie, but still not really my thing. For the most part, the humor was successful and surprising because it really wasn't something that had been done too much before. I still think that Deadpool isn't the greatest character, and Reynolds' acting is massively overhyped, so whilst the writing can be witty and funny at points, the presentation isn't anywhere near as refreshing. Like every other Marvel film, it's all just shot reverse shot. Although the action scenes are somewhat of an exception, they were okay. I think the film's opening was pretty great, even if it was where the film kind of peaked. If you think you'll like this film, then you will, and I do wish more superhero films weren't restricted by a PG-13 rating. Star Wars Episode 8, The Last Jedi is the first Star Wars film on this list that isn't total bollocks. It was actually rather decent. It's visually interesting, the musical composition is amazing, and I'm glad that they use a lot of the original trilogy's music and sounds. The special effects were also great and never distracted me. The acting was good for the most part. The whole thing was pretty consistently entertaining. However, it needs to be said that the beginning went on for far too long and there was quite a lot of filler. The climax with the ever so important lightsaber fight sucked, which was a shame. It was just so fake and slow. I hate how so many throwaway characters were just blatantly designed to sell merchandising. Rose was just awful. Overall, it's a dumb, entertaining movie with a good soundtrack and a sequence of events that, whilst a little messy, still hold up okay. Star Wars Rogue One is a strange addition to the franchise, but not necessarily a bad one, to be fair. The overall tone felt surprisingly mature and well thought out. The battle scenes were really gripping, the acting was really good, and the storyline was interesting. I'd say the weakest aspect of the film is the characters, who just aren't very developed or interesting, so when they all die near the end, you're just like, The ending of the film, though, despite being blatant nostalgia bait and mindless pandering, is just so cool that you don't even mind. 44 is Independence Day. The plot is thin and so is the character development, but as a thrilling, spectacle-filled summer movie, Independence Day delivers. Many say this is the one responsible for making Will Smith a star, which is honestly a bit of a con. I've never really been a fan of his in particular. Wolf Warrior 2 is another Chinese one, so I'll be quick. Yeah, I enjoyed it. It brought back the cheesy action of the 90s and 80s relatively well. It's pretty preachy, but still overall decent. Bear in mind I didn't watch the first one because I couldn't be bothered, but it didn't seem to take too much away from the experience. Spider-Man Homecoming is undeniably charming and fun, and it's quite a nice renewal of the character. I think Tom Holland does a good job playing the titular Spider-Man, but once again it's soured by typical Marvel blandness. In fact, I'd say the same for Captain America Civil War, so I'll slap that in 41. The OG Avengers movie is a little better than the two I just mentioned, but it just feels a lot more tightly written and well directed. Just a fun-ass, action-packed blockbuster with tons of charm. Toy Story 3 is the weakest of the first three Toy Story films, but still a decent and emotional end to the series. But it is a little ruined by it ultimately not being the end to the series. Again, I talk about it in my Pixar video. Now, this is actually a good film. Frozen is actually good. It's a pretty standard Disney film, but the music and soundtrack propels it from being bang average to actually good. Though it's a shame the most popular song is easily the weakest one in the movie. Actually, the summer one was pretty whack as well. The second weakest, maybe. I also absolutely despise the twist ending, especially because there was so much potential for a more likable, independent, and developed main character who doesn't need to depend on anyone. I discuss this a little in one of my previous videos once again, so have a look at that if you're interested. Inside Out and Coco are some of the best Pixar films since WALL-E, but that isn't really saying too much. Like, yeah, they're good, they look gorgeous, but at the end of the day, they're just kids' films, really. There's nothing really profound or interesting about them. I have a quick review of No Way Home already, so just watch that. I also have a quick review on The Batman, and I mentioned that I think it's a little better than No Way Home, so that's why it's here, one above it. The Dark Knight Rises is not bad at all, but nowhere near as good as the original Dark Knight in my opinion. Tom Hardy's post-produced voice is just so disgustingly distracting and bad, and Bane as a character is far weaker than the Joker. That being said, all of the performances were great, the score was amazing, and the directing was brilliant. Home Alone is a classic, and that doesn't anger me at all. I can really see why. The movie is pretty cute and charming, it's helped greatly by the corny American and Christmassy tone that doesn't take itself too seriously, which makes it a lot easier to accept how horribly Kevin is treated by his family. The third act is iconic, and it's just an overall very wholesome family flick. Top Gun Maverick is a damn good movie, and the first on this list that I would willingly watch again. Yup, that's right, we finally gotten to that point, we're finally at that level. Woo, yeah, good so job done, well Top Gun. Yeah, oh my god, good, I'm well so done, man. By golly goodness. We finally gotten to a point where it's a good but not great film. I think this film is exactly what the original should have been. It was a lot more pulled back and naked, if that makes sense, but it works spectacularly. The flying scenes were super well shot and very atmospheric, exhilarating and immensely satisfying. Without a doubt the high point of the film. The third act in particular was incredible. Now everything that isn't action or flying was pretty non-exceptional and bland, and so that's the reason it's 31st on the list. Zootopia is also pretty good for an animated film. For a kids movie, the social commentary could have been far worse, even if it was extremely on the nose and not subtle in the slightest. There are endless visual gimmicks thanks to the utterly gorgeous visuals and animation. Shakira was a really weird addition and her song sucked. The action was very well choreographed however, and I like how the world was introduced. The comedy was also pretty good for one of those movies. The twist at the end was pretty dumb however, and the villain's motivation basically boiled down to her being really racist. The bait and switch blueberry thing was also really obvious. The obligatory buddy comedy trope where the two MCs fall out and hate each other for like 2 minutes was so forced and annoying. Up is probably the best movie that Pixar has made since WALL-E. The first 10 minutes is some of the best storytelling to ever be presented on the big screen. Genuinely a masterpiece. The rest of the movie is meh. Joker takes the number 28 spot on this list. Joaquin Phoenix does a phenomenal job playing the titular character, and the directing is actually very solid. The soundtrack was great and the score was very atmospheric. The way the Joker was expressed and written is very interesting and delves into aspects of the character we've not seen before. I'm not a fan of how they forced Bruce Wayne into the story. That was a hardcore shoehorn, and the link to the killer of Bruce's parents was uber lame. Yeah, I'm not really in love with Avatar at all, despite its ridiculous performance and technical marvels. That being said, it is still a decent movie. I just don't think anything is overly impressive, other than on a technical level, because it does look great and holds up very well. It's just a shame that the characters are really cookie cutter and two-dimensional. The world is built quite nicely and does a good job hooking you in, but it does feel pretty bloated at points. The film is at its best during its most humble and small moments, but it drags out quite a bit and it asks a lot of its audience in terms of investing yourself in its huge war thematics. It would have worked a lot better with a more engaging story and heartier characters, I feel. I think Thor Ragnarok is a phenomenal Thor movie, a great superhero movie, and a good movie. As far as the Thor Thor movies go, this is literally the only one I can so much as bear, but it goes beyond just being bearable and actually becomes something I genuinely enjoy watching. A lot of the movie was improvised and it's so clear to see how much fun all the actors are having, and they do a brilliant job. The weird 80s Guardian of the Galaxy vibe was also pretty great, albeit not as great as Guardians. But it's a vibe that works very well for Thor, and paired with the fantastically choreographed action, it's a pretty nice viewing experience. Speaking of which, Avengers Infinity War is certainly one of the more impressive movies on this list. It was such a pleasant surprise to see Marvel not make an incomprehensible mess with a cast of so many characters. There's some interesting concepts at play, and perhaps the biggest point of interest was that there are actually palpable stakes and some great tension. I can actually enjoy this movie on a level that goes beyond it not taking itself too seriously, because it does take itself pretty seriously. Except this time it works. It really works. In fact, it might have been the best part of the film, because the jokes and humour were pretty sad and unfunny, and off-putting and didn't work at all. Despite the fairly long runtime, it never drags out and the visuals aren't as stale as Marvel usually is. The actors had brilliant opportunities to shine. Yep, really good and enjoyable film. Kudos. Jurassic Park is cheesy. Like, really cheesy, but the genuinely good moments and impressive aspects of filmmaking definitely outweigh the cheese. There's actually some solid symbolism thrown in there and I really enjoy it. It's definitely the best film with the word Jurassic in the title. Spider-Man is also another absolute cheese fest, but the cheese is like proper British cheese this time. Like, this is some very refined, extra mature cheddar cheese right here. I could just eat a whole block of it and just want more, yum yum. Spider-Man has the best type of cheese, and it infects the entire script in such an attractive way. The things holding this film back the most are that a lot of the action holds up pretty badly. Green Goblin's suit, for example, just looks bleeding terrible, and the actors look far too old, which is weird. Mary Jane is also dreadfully annoying, but it's Spider-Man in it, so it's all in good jest. Fun movie. So the infamous Titanic, baby. It's good, but I wouldn't call it great. I can certainly see why it's reached its almost cult status, because as far as romance goes, it's pretty generic and easily accessible. To be totally honest, I don't really care for this film, but what compelled me to place it at 23 is just how complete and solid the filmmaking is, how dynamic a lot of the shots are, and how great the performances were. It does just enough to be a rewatchable and fun film despite its many flaws. Finding Nemo is actually pretty weak as far as classic Pixar goes, but classic Pixar was such an amazing era of animation that doesn't really mean much, hence its position on the list. Finding Nemo is great, probably the first movie on this list that I would describe as great, meaning every future entry is at the very least pretty great. It looks gorgeous, which is so impressive considering its 2003 release date. It's held back by some cliches, like an overbearing father and a comic relief who verges on being just a little annoying. I'm also not a fan of how glorified the kidnapping aspect of this movie was, but I think that's just a personal problem. The writing is sharp and emotional, the humour works for the most part, and all the characters were okay at worst, but usually pretty lovable. Star Wars Episode 7 The Force Awakens is not only the best Star Wars film since Episode 6, but also a great standalone film in my opinion, which admittedly is slightly rose-tinted by my love for the franchise. Probably the most chilling and satisfying moments I've had in the cinema were when I viewed this film with my pal who got me into Star Wars. It was such a huge deal at the time, which I feel as though people have forgotten. Episode 7 was the talk of the town for years. That first teaser haunted everybody's mind in 2014, and when we sat down to watch it in 2015, I don't think anything can compare to the spine-tingling, mind-blowing feeling that came with the iconic as the famous yellow text rolls down the screen. I remember the sound design and soundtrack being so stupidly impressive here actually. When the Force is used, you can really feel it. They do such a good job displaying how these non-visual powers work in a way that couldn't be done in the original trilogy. Now that being said, it was horribly predictable, which is my main complaint. Very formulaic and a near carbon copy of A New Hope, which hey man, could definitely be a lot worse. Guardians 2 is my favourite Marvel movie, and granted, that might not mean a lot coming from someone like me who has been very vocal about their hatred for Marvel, but I have no choice to credit them where it's due. The Guardians of the Galaxy franchise is consistently and greatly entertaining. The first film was good but not great, but the second entry was no less than greatness. In terms of comedy, this is easily the funniest Marvel film, or at the very least the one that made me laugh the most, aided of course by the bombastic tone and beautiful visuals. Impressively though, and this is what separates it from the majority of this company's films, the emotional beats also work really well, and bounce off the comedy in a way that isn't at all jarring or whiplash-inducing like it was in Infinity War. It knows just when to pull back so as to not undercut any dramatic moments, and spends the perfect amount of time on each scene so nothing drags out for longer than necessary. Guardians has an identity of its own, which is something I could only wish Marvel allowed for their other projects. The negatives, however, include a slow start and some weaker characters, like Gamora and Nebula, who are really lame. Some of the close combat is also really obviously fake, which is something I talk about in my Shang-Chi review, but it seems as though I'm the only person who actually cares about that sort of thing for whatever reason. Whatever man, the movie is great and Yondu stole the show. Although I feel Inception is grossly overrated, I still enjoy it a lot. The movie is pretty full of inconsistencies, but it's still a fun world to be engrossed in. I'm very unclear of what the rules of this weird limbo world is, like they do a pretty sloppy job explaining the rules of this universe. Maybe I just don't get it, but it doesn't matter too much because this movie is still great. Even if it isn't genius, it makes you think, which is something I really appreciate from a film. I always love when you're thinking about the events of a film after you've already viewed it. And with ideas as complex as the ones covered here, it's almost inevitable you come across some inconsistencies. A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back. Even though I have my issues with them, we're far enough in this list for that not to really necessarily be a bad thing anymore. The original is such a brilliant introduction to the series in all of its aspects. Its visual storytelling is nothing short of stellar, and it contains some of the most outstanding world building and establishments that any franchise has ever seen. I mean, there's a reason that 10% of these 100 highest earning films are Star Wars ones. And it's all down to A New Hope being as great as it was. Episode 5 was dark, sinister, and ultimately even more involving than A New Hope. The Empire Strikes Back defies viewer expectations and takes the series to a heightened emotional level, with possibly the most infamous scene in movie history. Next, we're going to talk about Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty, which I personally believe to be as good as each other. There's some amazing symbolism and incredibly shockingly deep character analysis that can be done with these two films. What the two MCs represent in their respective worlds is hugely impressive and will mean something different to every viewer. It's very open to interpretation, which is one of the purest aspects of art. This is of course heavily helped by a timeless hand-drawn animation, which will look good for the rest of time. I guess hence the word timeless, I don't know why that was in the script. I talk a little bit more in depth about these films in my video essay about female characters, so I'll stop here for this video. Okay, my voice really is going, I can't do this anymore. I'm gonna go get some currywurst and I'll be right back. Jaws was such a trailblazing piece of horror whose ripple effects still reside in pretty much every horror-related thing in modern day, and upon rewatching it, yeah, I can certainly see why. It's no masterpiece or anything, but it's so unbelievably solid in terms of pretty much all aspects of filmmaking that there really isn't too much to critique outside of some predictable horror tropes. But even then, it's difficult to criticize this film for these, because in many ways, a lot of those tropes are only tropes because of this film. The movie is absolutely brilliant, and the chilling score has become one of such magnitude that it can be identified by probably 90% of people over the age of 10 years old. I think it's the performances that hold this up to the extent that it does hold up, because the acting and chemistry between the boys on the boat especially is really impressive and tangible. It very much deserves to be renowned and hailed as a classic in the genre. From one classic to another, Back to the Future is a brilliant film and probably the best in the franchise. I feel as though time travel, virtually by definition, is impossible to create in a way that's plot hole free or slightly nonsensical. But as far as this somewhat niche genre goes, Back to the Future does it best. Off the top of my head, this movie is the most consistent time travel movie I've ever seen, and it's now impossible to include the theme in any form of media without some sort of tribute or acknowledgement of it. I just love how American and cheesy this can get at points, but once again, it's a gorgeous Italian cheese that you can't be cynical about because of just how charming it is. From the nerdy American kid to the big obnoxious high school jock, it's all just so pleasant to watch. They really don't make films like this anymore. The chemistry between Christopher Lloyd and Michael J. Fox is some of the best in the scene. The ending is simply incredible and action-packed and scored fantastically. One of the best main themes of all time. I love this movie. Yes, it's corny. Yes, it's pretty dumb at points. And yes, it's thoroughly predictable. It presents and begins such an overtold, encouraging story of the underdog that is entirely likable and sorely unmatched. It's a story that has legitimately been told thousands of times, but by golly, if this isn't one of the best presentations of that story, then I don't know what is. This is about so much more than the final fight, even though it is a brilliant part of the film. It's about a man trying to find his ever so earned share of happiness, however small it may be. It's one of the best fighting movies of all time, and for good reason, with such a raw and gritty feel that I don't think any of the sequels succeeded in replicating. By the time Rocky runs up the steps of the Philadelphia Museum of Art in one of the single most incredible moments in all of cinema, we feel like we've been with him every step of the way, and it's a journey you'd have to be a real anomaly not to enjoy. So, Spider-Man 2 and The Dark Knight are really difficult ones for me, because I genuinely can't decide which one I like more. I think that these two films are absolutely the best superhero movies of all time, but they're both shooting for such different tones. The Dark Knight is so much more real and dark and gritty, and does an amazing job displaying that, while Spider-Man 2 does a spectacular job presenting what's basically the first Spider-Man film but better in every single way, especially in terms of effects and visuals, as the puppeteering and horrific Raimiism still hold up just as well as they did when the film was released. I think that Spider-Man 2 has more entertainment value, but that The Dark Knight is objectively more impressive, with better writing and more watchable and chilling acting. All I'm gonna say is, I'm glad we're at a point on this list where I'm deciding which movie is better rather than which one makes me want to die the least. Yep, Shrek 2 is number 8. For real. Memes aside, it's actually one of the best animated movies of all time, in my opinion. Or at least CGI animated, especially for a children/family film. Once again, I do have an entire video dedicated to Shrek where I make my opinion on this film very clear, so I'll stop at this. Shrek 2 has a perfect soundtrack and gorgeous visuals, and whilst it wasn't as emotional as it tried to be, pretty much every other aspect is sensational. Love this one. This is actually quite an unpopular opinion, but I think that Episode 6 of Star Wars is the best that the franchise has to offer. It begins harshly by killing off probably the most beloved character from the previous films, immediately displaying to the audience that there are actually going to be stakes in this, which I thought was slightly lacking in episodes 4 and 5. As much as I enjoy those films, it never really felt as though any of the main cast were in danger. There are a lot of plot conveniences, such as the clones and troops shooting endlessly and never hitting anything. In this movie, they actually do hit people, and it's a real relief. Like, yes, I'm actually worried for these characters now, and they fully commit to it as well, killing off the series' most important and influential characters. Darth Vader's brilliance simply cannot be ignored. He's one of the best and most complex villains in film history. I thought the Ewoks were a welcome bit of lightheartedness in an otherwise dark and dreary story. I think the acting was at its best here, and the actors really feel as though they've had become their characters at this point. The chase scenes are thrilling, the lightsaber battles are amazing, and the soundtrack is so good that my roommates are banging on my wall as I record this because I'm unintentionally getting a little bit too loud because of how excited it gets me. It also might have something to do with the fact that it's 2 AM, to be fair. Forrest Gump's greatest asset is undoubtedly the script, as well as Tom Hanks' performance. It's such an inspiring story that demonstrates in such an entertaining way that every individual has the capacity to change the world. And whilst I do prefer the book that it was based on, this doesn't at all mean that this is a lackadaisical interpretation. Considering how difficult it is to make a lovable yet low intellectually minded man like Gump work, the team did an amazing job. You feel and care for each and every character, and there are no shortage of tear-jerking moments. This movie is a brilliant blend of everything you could ask for in a movie. Humor, drama, romance, it's all tied together impressively to make such a holistic viewing experience. 1994 might have just been the best year in the movie industry, and no doubt part of that is thanks to Forrest Gump. Playing as both an exciting sci-fi adventure and a remarkable portrait of childhood, this is what I believe to be Steven Spielberg's best work. A touching tale of a homesick alien remains a piece of movie magic for young and old. It was one of the first movies where the main character was a kid and the movie was not totally dumbed down. It was a great emotional buddy movie that perhaps to truly appreciate, you needed to be 7 years old in 1982. The reason it's this high on the list is because of its strange ability to make you feel 7 years old and in 1982. And I think that this is mainly a result of the beautifully magical soundtrack and shots. It creates such a lovely vibe that is so comforting you don't even focus on some of the blandness this film is admittedly guilty of from time to time. Alright, if you're not a fan of Disney, old movies, or animation, then probably click off now because the next couple movies are really going to display my taste in film. Lady and the Tramp is adorable. So cute. I love it so much. I love that it's told through the perspective of dogs. I love how it's not love at first sight between the two future dog lovers. The music is utterly gorgeous and reels you in completely. There is no villain, and I think that serves the movie brilliantly. The writing is hearty, the animation is just superb. God, I could go on and on, but I like these final movies for a lot of the same reasons, so out of fear of repeating myself, we're gonna move on. Pinocchio does everything that Lady and the Tramp does, but adds onto it an extra layer of sharpness in the script. It's more than just a magical old Disney film, it's actually an incredibly clever character piece and case study. Incredibly meticulous in the way that characters interact with the world, and profoundly mature for a children's film. The fact that it was released in 1940, when the planet had a completely different set of humans, is something that genuinely makes me feel a little bit existential. Every single person who had anything to do with this film is now dead. But they aren't really dead. They still exist, and it's through this incredible work of art. What a legacy this magnificent team of talent has left behind. Movies like this just remind me of why I love the art form so much. It reminds me why I made this video in the first place, even though I really started to regret it halfway through the list. Which I don't anymore, by the way. I'm really quite glad I made this video. 2 years after Pinocchio, a mere 2 years, the world was graced with Bambi, one of the greatest movies of all time, and one that on some days I would switch with number 1 on this list. It really is about 50-50. This movie gets bonus points for not having an awful live-action remake, at least as of the time this video was released. Please don't make one, I'm practically begging. It would be such a shame to see every aspect of this film ruined by animation aristocrats who don't actually know a thing about what made these movies great. You're probably Alright. You're probably realizing why I put the live-action remakes so low on this list now, why I detest them so much. I think that the more you love and understand the original films, the more you're inclined to hate those remakes. And as you can tell, I really love these films. Bambi is a masterpiece, I'm gonna be straight up. We're at that point now. These final 2 films are masterpieces. Now that doesn't mean they're perfect, but we'll get to that. We'll start with the art, which is gorgeous as always, but particularly atmospheric and artistic here. You really feel as though you're totally engrossed in nature. There are so many utterly and incredibly tense and dark themes and moments here. Of course you have the infamous mother's death, but this moment is always one that I found so profoundly impactful.
Listen. He's coming. Hush. Be quiet. He's coming closer. Be calm. Don't get excited. We'd better fly. No, don't fly. Whatever you do, don't fly. He's almost here. I can't stand it any longer.
Much like Lady and the Tramp, it's the lack of villain that really propels this film to another level. The villain is man. The villain is nature. You can't exactly fight against it. It's something you never actually see, but the looming threat is more than enough. It's perfect, even. Even if Bambi himself isn't the most interesting character, it's still great seeing them grow older, and the story is mostly told via the atmosphere anyway. You're probably wondering why I'm not going in depth about certain specific aspects of the story at this point in the list. To answer that question, I'll say this. I'm pretty positive that I will make full-blown videos on these movies at some point, so believe me, I will get to it. Until then, be glad I'm not spoiling it for you. It's extremely likely that if you're part of my generation, you haven't seen the previous 3 movies that I've mentioned, so go watch them. I'm deadly serious. I believe that these are films that absolutely everybody needs to see. In terms of number 1 on this list, I would say the exact same thing, however I'm pretty sure that you have already seen this one. And if you haven't, then I genuinely don't know what to say to you, because it's The Lion King. The Lion King makes number 1 on this list, but like I said, depending on the day, this could very easily be number 2. But either way, it doesn't really matter, because I love them both pretty much equal. I actually believe that as a movie, Bambi is significantly stronger than The Lion King, the reason being the villain. Bambi's villain, or lack thereof, is a perfect choice, whereas The Lion King has Scar, who, don't get me wrong, is pretty brilliant and threatening and three-dimensional, until Simba runs away, at which point he actually becomes rather shallow and vapid, and to be frank, uninteresting. There isn't really much to his character, he's just evil guy. So you're probably wondering based on that why this is number 1, and there are a few reasons. Number 1 may very well be nostalgia. We'll just get that one out of the way, but the first of the legitimate reasons is the music. The Lion King is quite possibly my favourite musical, and the songs composed by Elton John in particular are the main aspect that propel this film above the more somber and stoic Bambi. The second thing is the animation, which isn't too much of a surprise considering this was made half a century later. I honestly lack the words to describe my affection for this hand-drawn style of animation, but The Lion King was actually a rather groundbreaking film in terms of computer animation. Moments like the stampede scene are some of the most influential, dynamic, and incredible sequences, not only in the history of animation, but in movies in general. The third and final reason is the characters, Mufasa being my favourite. Other than Scar, I really do enjoy them all. What a truly beautiful film that I can only be thankful for existing. Hello, welcome to the end of the video. This is probably a good time to say that I don't find any of these movies perfect, and whilst I do hold the most recently discussed films in very high regard, at the end of the day it's only the best of a bunch of very successful films, which tend to not be too great. Like, they tend to be pretty bad. Much like music, the most mainstream and marketable projects that achieve the highest level of popularity tend to be the most generic, virtually by definition, so they're not really necessarily good by any means. They're just not all bad either. Musicians like Ed Sheeran, for example, and that's sort of what this list is, just a whole lot of Ed Sheerans. I haven't judged these movies numerically, as in like sort of with a out of 10 system like I usually do with my reviews, because I felt as though that would sort of take away from the overarching meaning of this video and people would just sort of try and fix themselves on that number rather than what I actually have to say about the movies. But I would absolutely give the final 4 movies a 9 out of 10, and depending on the day I'd probably give Bambi and The Lion King a 10, but I'd be more inclined to give Bambi a 10. I think Bambi is the most perfect movie on this list. In terms of lowest rated movies, I'd probably give the first 12 all 1 out of 10s. They are so horrible. I can release a document either on the community tab or in the description or whatever with like numerical ratings for each of these films, but only if there's a demand for it, because I don't find it particularly necessary. I really hope you enjoyed the video. It was a real difficult one, this one, like easily the hardest I've worked on a video because I had to watch so many goddamn movies to make it work. As always, but now more than ever, a like, comment and subscription would be very much appreciated. We're monetized now, so if you do, you're actually supporting me monetarily, an impoverished uni student, so thank you for that. Also, special thanks to the people that are actually watching this far. If you're at this point in the video, leave a comment, but like subtly work the word radical into the comment and I'll know you're a real one. Now though, I think that's all I have to say, so hopefully I'll see you all in the near future. Thanks again for watching and much love to you all.